I'm so excited to welcome you all to this conversation. Uh, I'm Suzanne Kahn. I'm the vice president of the think tank at the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm thrilled to have two of our fellows, Sarah Bloom Raskin, our newest senior fellow, and Kate Aronoff, who's been a fellow in our climate program for the last few years, here to have this important conversation at a moment when the effects of climate change, I think, are feeling even more visceral than they do on an average day with the hurricane coming. So I am going to hand this over to Chris Karlsson in 1 second, but I want to introduce her. Chris is our Deputy Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute. She leads our work on the democratic implementation of the renewable transition, the fossil fuel wind down, environmental justice, and the intersection of climate and macroeconomics. And she will introduce our other speakers. Before I hand it over to her, I have the fun job of a month before the election, reminding everyone here that Roosevelt is a C3 and this is a C3 conversation. So we cannot comment on any candidates or their specific platforms today, but I know there is lots to say anyway. So welcome all, and Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to everyone on the call for joining us. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our conversation today. Over the next hour, we'll be hearing from two great minds in the climate space, as Suzanne mentioned, Sarah Bloom Raskin and Kate Aronoff, who will be chatting about Kate's latest Roosevelt Institute report, Green Industrial Policy's Unfinished Business, a publicly managed fossil fuel wind down. I will then join in to moderate a Q&A with you all, so please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout. As the title suggests, this paper makes two vital arguments. One, that an industrial policy approach to building renewables, while critical to a green transition, will not be enough to achieve our climate goals without a coordinated and aggressive wind down strategy. And two, that the public sector needs to proactively drive this wind down. Private fossil fuel firms and markets will not do this fast enough to halt the progress of global warming and will not deliver a just and equitable transition. At Roosevelt, we have argued for a federal investment-led approach to building out renewable infrastructure since we began our work on climate. And over the past 4 years, we've seen a significant paradigm shift in favor of climate investment and a green industrial policy style approach to renewable build-out. Since the passage of the IRA, solar capacity has increased by 36%. We've increased the share of electric vehicles on the road by 31%. The law has catalyzed nearly $300 billion in clean energy and manufacturing investments. But while more renewable energy capacity is coming online, there are not commensurate decreases in fossil fuel production or consumption. So the harder battle is ahead of us, which is decommissioning a powerful incumbent sector in order to transition away from fossil fuels. The danger of an approach to energy policy that celebrates the expansion of renewable and fossil fuel capacity is that it decenters the most urgent and critical goal, which is halting the progress of climate change. It also relies on the assumption that markets are sufficient to organize away from fossil fuels, that renewables will simply outcompete them and losses and gains will be efficiently and fairly distributed. This is a theory of markets that we've spent a decade exposing and critiquing at Roosevelt, and those lessons are more important than ever now as we undertake the biggest economic transformation of our time. The case for a proactive, coordinated wind down of fossil fuels is becoming increasingly undeniable as we break global records in oil production. Fossil fuel firms are abandoning their net zero pledges and opting to expand production instead. And we suffer from back-to-back unprecedented and deadly natural disasters. As we all sit here and wait in fear of what Hurricane Milton will do to Florida, this conversation about solutions to the root cause of climate change could not be more timely. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Sarah Bloom Raskin is a Roosevelt Institute Senior Fellow, former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, former member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Colin W. Brown Distinguished Professor of the Practice at Duke Law School, and partner of Kaya, a climate advisory firm based in London and Copenhagen. Kate Aronoff is a Roosevelt Institute Fellow, staff writer at the New Republic, the author of Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, co-author of A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal, and co-editor of We Own the Future: Democratic Socialism, American Style. So I will pass it to Sarah and Kate. Take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that terrific introduction, Chris, and thank you to Roosevelt for really hosting what is an extraordinarily timely discussion, but one that I think is going to really need to stir and spur a lot of action. And I'm really pleased to be able to be in dialogue today with Kate Aronoff. I should say Kate and I actually we've had this dialogue before. We actually did it in Hyde Park for a smaller group, and the resonance of it and the importance of it, I think, is really too great for us to have just kept it to a small group. So we're opening it up. We know that with us today will be a lot of very important perspectives, and we are going to save time to hear them. I think that's important because as great as this paper is that Kate has written, the importance of the issues that she has exposed are absolutely critical and timely. But there's a lot of work here. There's a lot of work ahead, and the perspectives of all of you will be important in furthering this. So this is a beginning, not an end. Let me say a couple of things about the structure of our discussion. So Kate here has written really just a terrific paper, okay? Green Industrial Policies, Unfinished Business, okay? It is unfinished, and we're going to explore that. So we're going to have essentially three parts here that I'd like to steer us through. First of all, this notion of it being unfinished, okay? Why is it unfinished? Why are building renewables necessary but not sufficient to achieve climate goals? What happens really if we stay on the current path of having a market-based approach that does not include a coordinated, aggressive wind-down strategy that is proactive, not reactive, that accompanies this transition? So the first thing we'll do is we'll explore why, why we need to have a concerted strategy. The second piece I'd like to explore is really, again, to dig into the notion of why private firms and markets will not do this fast enough or equitably enough. And in other words, why do we need a public sector driven wind down? Why is that critical? And by the way, have we ever done anything like that before? Is there any precedent for that to lean on? And then thirdly, I think we should dig into some of Kate's proposals. So for those of you who've had the chance to read the paper, you will see a whole host of proposals, some of which I would say should be prioritized, some of which I would say will require certain kinds of actions. I mean, we need to kind of think through implementation, but I want to start talking about some of these proposals, and we'll see if we've got time to kind of explore a handful of them and hear from Kate as to how she thinks about these proposals, and then of course all of you as well. So with that, Kate, what a thrill again to be able to do this. Let's start really, and again, a big applause for this paper, for this work. Your leadership is noteworthy here. But remind us as to the why here. Why do we need essentially some kind of coordinated and aggressive wind down strategy? Aren't we on a good path where we are?
Thanks so much, Sarah, and to everyone at Roosevelt for their patience in guiding a journalist through writing a policy report, which is no easy task. And Sarah very graciously provided comments on the paper, along with many other people at Roosevelt and beyond. So just really excited to get to talk about these ideas and get to do a really different type of thing that I usually do in my day-to-day work as a reporter. So let's start with that and maybe dig into the title of this report, right? What does industrial policy, green industrial policy's unfinished business mean? So just to reiterate some of what Chris said in the intro, right? We've seen this really positive shift in how governments in the US in particular talk about climate, right? We're not talking about sort of small market tweaks, about, small levels of carbon pricing and those sorts of things that were sort of the way that those conversations happened in the Beltway for a very long time. We're talking about really active state involvement in the economy. Not that that hasn't always been there, but there's a real sort of eagerness to say, we want these sorts of things to be built, and we're going to provide tax subsidies and different sorts of incentives so that that happens. And that is very different than what you might have heard in DC a couple of years ago. So as Chris said too, that has been a success, right? We've seen coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, really sort of impressive amounts of investment in things like wind and solar facilities, manufacturing facilities, in electric vehicle and battery production. That bill is working on its own terms, right? The Inflation Reduction Act is doing the job it set out to do. The argument in this report is that that is a relatively limited job relative to the full scope of the climate crisis that we face, and in this piece of it called the energy transition, right? And so as we build up all of the stuff that we need in order to electrify the economy, in order to decarbonize the economy, get more activity onto the grid, decarbonize the grid, shut down coal plants, all of that stuff. We also need to be thinking about what is happening in the fossil fuel economy, right? Because if we're only building up wind and solar and low carbon energy and technologies and not sort of paying attention to this other piece, that assumes sort of the free market logic, right? That as the sort of growing stock of low carbon goods comes online, it will outcompete necessarily the stock of incumbent energy producers and things like internal combustion engine vehicles and things like that. And so this report focuses pretty specifically on oil and gas production. It's already, a 50-page report. Did not want to bite off more than that. And so in this small chunk of it, what I sort of focus on is what are the ways in which the sector has historically been supported by the industry, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But also, what does it look like to reconcile these industrial policies that the US government has, right? We have longstanding industrial policy to support oil and gas development, to support fossil fuels. And now we have this newer industrial policy to support clean energy. And so if we're really thinking seriously about the problem of the energy transition, we need to bring those two things together and make sure that they aren't out competing one another, they aren't imposing constraints on one another in the way that energy transitions do, and that they're really messy historically. And so having a broader set of sort of planning capacities to be able to look at all this sort of holistically and say, what is the, down to the level of stuff, right? Down to the land, down to the infrastructure and assets. How do we say, get a real handle on kind of what all is going on and how to really transition it and not only sort of add more good stuff into the mix, but think about what the sort of full picture of this energy transition looks like.
Well, Kate, just a little bit more on that. And I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a minute, but why would pricing signals not be sufficient? So in other words, as more renewables come online and become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, doesn't that essentially outprice oil and gas? So in other words, that becomes such a compelling price proposition that essentially it displaces, if you sort of believe in price signals in the market, that would displace fossil fuel production, which would be comparatively priced high. Why is that mechanism not sufficient?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you have to look at sort of just all of the intransigence baked into the system, right? And so the price of energy that we pay, whether on our utility bills or at the pump, right? That is reflective of any number of things, right? And so a lot of the sort of talking points you get from Republicans, right, around things like the Inflation Reduction Act is that the government is engaged in picking winners and losers. And they'll point to the production tax credit, the investment tax credit, to say that this is making these things artificially cheap and getting them onto the grid, and it's not a level playing field. If you dig a little closer into sort of what all goes into fossil fuels, you'll find just an enormous amount of government support for that, right? That is not necessarily reflected in the price in any obvious way, but that does make these things cheaper in a way that, you know, necessarily just distorts the price of the stuff, right? And so that goes all the way back to things like the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, right? This body tasked with regulating telecoms and railways back in the 1920s. Being asked by drillers who were just starting to dig up oil in Oklahoma to come in and stop them from drilling so that they don't bring the price down too much and so that their companies can stay in business. These sort of elaborate market coordination tools. And this continues right up to the present, right? And so even something like fracking, right? The shale boom that is credited as being this sort of great example of private sector dynamism. In reality, the main driver behind fracking arguably was the federal government, right? Starting in the 1970s, projects like the Eastern Gas Shales Project, poured invaluable research support, basic research, feasibility studies, sent, you know, government experts out to see, can we do fracking, right? Companies thought it was too expensive, and so the federal government, because they had the goal of increasing domestic oil and gas production, said we're going to figure out how to get fuel out of these tight rocks, and, you know, added to that generous tax credits. One in place from 1980 through 2002 is credited with doubling unconventional gas production over that time period. And so if you look at prices and even at sort of subsidies through things like the tax code, right? $20 billion for fossil fuels through state and federal incentives. That really only gets to the surface. And so the argument for not having all of this sort of go through the pricing mechanism is to say, right, that there is, a century or more of support for the fossil fuel industry. To replicate anything like that, we need to do what the US government has always done to meet energy goals, right? Is to be really systematic about it and say, we have all these tools available to us. Let's use them, and let's look holistically again at our energy system. See, what do we want less of? What do we want more of? And how do we make sure that in getting from A to B, we're not throwing people out of work and creating a much bigger mess?
Yeah. So let's say we do nothing. Let's say we just keep on sort of an IRA approach. We, the credits are maintained, they have long lives, they get used, the work gets extended into the grid, because of course we've got distribution and grid issues that need some attention as well. But if we continue on that course, is that enough? Does that raise any concerns with you? Could that be sufficient? Which is essentially taking an IRA approach and extending it sort of further downstream.
Even keeping the conversation at the level of the energy transition, right? Not to bring in the sort of whole range of things we need for the climate crisis to deal with disasters like Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene. That is a much, much broader topic that we won't have time for today. But even looking just at the energy transition, right? There is a huge risk that as we make this transition that is going too slowly, right? It's happening, but it's not happening as fast as we need it to, that people and communities really get left behind in that process, in having a messier transition than we need to. So something I talk about in the report, drawing on work, from folks like the Roosevelt Institute and others who've looked into this, is this problem of orphan wells, right? There are an estimated 10 million orphan, abandoned, idled, marginal legacy wells, basically wells that either aren't producing commercially viable amounts of fuel anymore, or are, have fallen into disrepair in some way, or are not being tracked on anyone's balance sheet. We don't really know how many of them there are, right? EPA studies of this are notoriously spotty. It's very hard to track where these things are because they're not on anyone's books, right? Either they were abandoned 50 years ago, or they shuffled through any number of shell companies. And so nobody really knows how many of these there are. And on one level, the public is already bearing the cost of cleaning that up, right? Through the benzene, through the methane, through all of the sort of public health effects of these wells, which are leaking any number of chemicals into the air and water. So that's one way in which this cost is already being put onto the public. Another way is very directly financial, right? In that the sort of laws governing what these companies are supposed to pay to clean up those wells, right? Things like bonding requirements, are controlled by a real patchwork of institutions, and many of these are really out of date. This past year, the Department of Interior worked to update those rules to demand more, which is great, but there are still many of these wells out here that no one can pay to clean up at the moment because polluters aren't being made to pay for them, and there's just not an incentive baked in for them to do anything but leave these behind or sell them off to someone who'll take them for cheap, right? And so I really like the study that Carbon Tracker did, looking at California, which you think California, you think a proactive state that's really gotten the stuff under control. You might also know that California has historically been a very prolific oil producer. Anyone who lives in LA can see the sort of pump jacks going at any time. So in California, Carbon Tracker estimates it'll cost $21 billion to decommission oil wells through, I believe, 2030. But folks should check the study about the exact timeline. In that time, when it would need to decommission those wells, the total oil and gas production in the state is only projected to make $6.3 billion. So even aside from whatever the bonding requirements are, however much of that they're supposed to pay in, companies are going to make $6.3 billion, and it's going to cost $20 billion to clean up those wells, just to clean them up, right? And so there is just very little, there are very few guardrails around this process, and these costs just will be borne by the public. And I think I don't want to spend too long, and folks should check out the report, which lays all this out in much greater detail than we'll be able to do here. But also just want to mention the incredible wave of consolidation that's happening with the industry and really threatens to exacerbate these problems, right? And so what you've seen specifically since COVID restrictions have ended, since 2022, is larger companies buying up smaller companies who really didn't make money over the course of the shale boom, right? And so now that interest rates have gotten higher, now that the business of fracking has changed, and there's less of a premium on just drilling as much as possible, economies of scale are becoming really important, right? And so you have bigger companies just able to make more money off of this really capital intensive process of fracking, coming in and buying up smaller shale producers, right? So you have Exxon buying up major producers in the Permian. Hess, just a real wave of mergers is happening. And as that happens, right, naturally, companies do not keep everything they buy. And so they'll sell some things off to whoever will buy them. And there's no way of tracking where those assets go, right? There's no way of saying, if you move this off your balance sheet, is it still producing, right? And so even if, BP, for instance, which has done this in Alaska, selling off its oil assets there, just because they sell off, they divest assets, drilling assets to make their sort of carbon emissions look better, doesn't mean that production isn't happening, doesn't mean those emissions aren't happening. And so part of what I talk about in the report is to really have a holistic way to look at where are those emissions, because those aren't being tracked by companies, and there is not really a way to track that in the federal government.
Yeah. And I want to talk about some of those proposals, actually, and that will be one of them. But before we get there, I just want to react really to some of what you've just described so well, Kate. The IRA really is not enough, I think you've made that case quite compellingly. And I think you've also said that a public sector role is not unprecedented. You point to examples really of, first of all, that there are several tools used by government. They've typically been used actually to foster fossil fuel production. And they haven't really shifted into use for a for a decarbonized transition. So there are tools that exist with the public sector at different levels, federal, state, local. I think you've got, you talk about a host of them. And historically, they have been used. They just have been used in favor, really, of a sector that is imposing significant costs on communities, on households, on our health, on the economy. So I think that's really, I think you've made a very good case for that. I would also add that that this notion of a transition is not one that is an on-off switch. I mean, this is going to take many, many years, and a lot is going to happen in the course of it. And query as to whether markets alone will be able to actually address the different issues as they come up, and do it in a way. One, remember, we're dealing with sort of an issue that has time dependency. We don't have ages to fix this, to work on this, to get ahead of this. And two, markets do not deal with equitable and distributional issues, and we know there are clearly issues associated with equities that that are embedded in the climate crisis. So. Proposals. So what we do, where do we go from here? And one of the things that's just so remarkable about Kate Aronoff is she's showing us the problem. She's showing us we can do something about it. And she goes so far as to give us this menu of proposals. And I want to talk about a couple of them. We don't have time to explore all of them, but I'd like to pull out a couple of them and hear you explain them. You started with this notion of, you've mentioned now this registry of fossil fuel assets, keeping track of the orphaned wells and this sort of thing. And I want to hear you talk about that some more. But before you do that, say something about this notion of bailouts. My sense is that, as I've sort of seen fiscal and monetary responses to particular crises, there have been bailouts. Some have been explicit bailouts and some have been implicit bailouts, but we have bailouts as seems to be a policy option in this, the way sort of the way we deal with things. Okay. And I'm not saying that they're inevitable. In fact, I'd like to think that we could have issues, we could have downturns that didn't involve bailouts. So this notion of kind of bailouts with conditions has come up. You call it, I think, bailouts with strings. Say a little bit about, one, why there may be bailouts and what kind of entities could be sort of coming to the public trough for bailout funds. What are you predicting there? And then secondly, what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, bailouts happen, as you said, right? If folks were, paying attention during the 2008 financial crisis, bailouts happened, right, of the banks. And during the pandemic, right? You saw the Federal Reserve bond buying program buy up corporate bonds, right? And that process, while obviously the Federal Reserve, and this is an area Sarah knows more than I do, is tasked with being impartial, right? That process is vulnerable to politics in some ways, right? And so you saw during COVID, as this bond buying program was being laid out, oil companies lobby to have more favorable terms, for instance, to allow companies with a huge debt load to be eligible for these bailout programs, right? And so this is not a perfect process, right? Many sort of companies can lobby for this, and the oil industry is especially good, right, at lobbying for preferential treatment, as they've received through the tax code, as they've received from federal regulators for as long as they've existed. And so while, the economy is cyclical, right? Downturns happen. In the oil industry, it is especially cyclical and especially vulnerable to downturns. So part of why the oil industry was so interested in the pandemic in lobbying was because they had spent 10 years effectively losing money on fracking, right? Fracking is a very expensive process that is very hard to make money doing. They happened in the lead up to 2019 to 2020 to have, had investors with cash to park because interest rates were really low, who just gave them a pretty wide leash to say, go out and drill as much as you need to. Don't worry so much about paying us back, right? And they did that, and they lost money. And so when oil prices crashed during the pandemic because people were driving and flying less, and there were travel restrictions, they were really hard up, right? And they, could not handle it. Especially these smaller and mid-sized companies needed federal support in order to keep going. And so that's what they asked for. So if we know that's going to happen, right? If we know that the oil and gas industry is especially cyclical and does face these downturns periodically, what do we do about that? If we know they're going to ask for money, what if instead of just giving it to them, we put strings on that money? If we're helping you out, don't we get a say in what you're using that money to do? So can't the federal government require even to just track emissions, right? Even to monitor sort of the emissions that you're responsible for, both carbon and methane and other sorts of environmental harms. Can that require strings that you make all of your balance sheets public, right? Can you, in exchange for getting a bailout, be made to show what are you selling off? What have you sold off? What are the emissions of those assets? Just having some sort of basic requirement around, having something to show for all the money the federal government has given. And that can happen in many different ways, but bailouts are an especially good window in which the government can ask for some return on its investment, right? And, I think probably the best version of that is to say you need to reduce emissions if you're going to get this bailout. And it's relatively easy to do that. If we're giving them money, we can, put strings on that money.
I also like the idea too that we can be thinking about that now. Actually, we can be thinking about that before there's an actual need for providing federal funds for some of these entities. So I like that. And I think that there's, and you start to mention quite a number. Now let's talk about one of them that you actually mentioned as being a condition to a bailout, but I think also exists quite independently, which is this notion of an index or a registry. Say a little bit more about that, because that also strikes me as something that we can be doing or thinking about doing right now.
Yeah, so I mentioned the problem with orphaned and abandoned wells before, right? This huge stock of pretty toxic assets that nobody really wants on their balance sheets unless they're planning to do something sort of shady with it. And we don't know where they are, right? The EPA has tried to study this. Different federal agencies have tried to study this. But we really don't have a good sense of where all of the oil and gas assets in the country are, or what their emissions are, importantly, right? Either of carbon and methane, but also things like benzene and sort of the chemicals that they're leaching out often into the air and water. And so the idea for a registry of these assets would be to require companies to disclose, what do you have? What's on your balance sheets? And so that when, especially sort of asset transfers happen, when there's divestments, when there's consolidations, they actually know what is changing hands, right? Because often what companies will do, they'll shed these assets they don't want off to private equity companies, off to smaller firms, and there's no way of telling sort of what, where they're going or what the emissions associated with that production are. And so to have that all in one place is not that hard, right? We can centralize that amount of information. And, I'll say, and maybe we can talk about this a bit before Q&A, but some of these proposals in the report for this registry, for the idea of a living will, sort of mandating.
Yeah, say something about the living will. That's an interesting one. And by the way, there is precedent, certainly in the banking context, for doing something on living wills. And that one also struck me as really quite intriguing. Tell us why. Yeah.
Yeah, it's borrowed from post-financial crisis reform, right? To say that if a company goes bust in the way, you know, that folks like Carbon Tracker and others have said it could happen for a while, right? To have these stranded assets that become too much for companies to handle, to have a living will to say, this is how you will wind down in a way that does not leave the public holding the bag for your business failure. That's the idea, right? Is just to say, so that you do not only sort of sell off to shady private equity firms, to any number of other actors in the economy, we can keep track of where all of those carbon intensive activities are going and happening.
Yep. Yep. You know, what's interesting is I listen to you, Kate, and hear you elaborate on these proposals. It occurs to me, that there are a couple of institutions that we have to also kind of think about whether they, sort of the role they're going to play. And I'm thinking here of the Supreme Court, and I'm thinking here of the Federal Reserve, two institutions that are very much in the public eye, sort of credibility enhancing, setting precedent, working in a way that guides a lot of actions. And in both cases here, I'm thinking of the Supreme Court. I'm thinking of their overruling Chevron deference. So this was a recent case coming from John Roberts, where we learned that there's now a displacement really away from expert agency determinations into the judiciary. The federal judiciary would be making determinations when statutes are vague or ambiguous. And this strikes me as quite problematic. Anytime I think we move away from expertise into something else, I think there's cause for concern. But I listen to some of your proposals and I say to myself, will there be, what will the role of these institutions be in challenging some of these, I think, very, very necessary proposals? By the way, I happen to think that there are ways through this. The Fed, for example, again, if the Fed was kind of the repository for the living wills, and where would the repository for the living wills that you're contemplating be, and who would move that forward? And to the extent that is something that, if the Fed is participating in the bailout of these institutions, if there are going to be bailouts, what kind of roles does this put the Fed in? So anyway, it's, I think, all kind of, there's some sort of big institutional issues that we have to think about as well. What I'd like to do is, Chris, turn it to you, see what questions have come in for Kate. I think we could definitely keep talking. This is I just think this is an extraordinary conversation. So very interested to hear what questions people have for Kate.
Great, thank you both so much, and I will be the question presenter. And I'll start with a question I got that says, how can the just transition framework help or apply here? Is what you're advocating for basically a just transition for all that now extends to include fossil fuel incumbent producers?
Yeah, so one of the proposals in the report is for a transition coordination administration. So sort of extending the logic of the management of fossil fuel assets more generally to look, what do we do with folks who work in the fossil fuel industry, who have skills that we need, right? What do we do with the land that is being used for fossil fuel development that could be used for solar, for wind, for any number of the things that we actually need to build. And so the proposals in there, and the idea is to have a sort of democratic governance around that, which brings in voices from labor, which brings in voices from local governments, from state governments, and creates a way to reallocate assets in the way that we need them to be reallocated, right? Both, sort of workers, land, even physical infrastructure, right? The sorts of oil and gas servicing equipment that can be used for something like geothermal. But having sort of a clearinghouse to sort through those questions rather than leaving that piecemeal up to the private sector, which is just sort of the default now. There is no sort of coordinating mechanism federally through which to make sure that things that have been things and people and assets that have been used for oil and gas can be put to use for the energy transition. And so the transition coordination administration proposal is proposed as a way to do that, and to have that not be entirely top down, but to be really sort of place specific, and that pays attention to like the ways in which the fossil industry looks different in New Jersey from Colorado, or in Oklahoma to California, right? These are very different states, very different energy economies. And so having that be built sort of from the ground up in different places, and responsive to the needs of those places.
That's actually a great segue into another question that I got, which is, what role do you think labor unions play in this transition, and especially in specific states that are fossil fuel producers? Like, the person who asked this question is specific to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I can't speak in too much detail to Pennsylvania, just because I don't know it quite as much, despite having lived in Philly for a little while. But yeah, I mean, I think you see sort of different versions of this around the world, right? In that places like Germany, there are worker union representation on the boards of companies, right? And so they have a greater level of buy-in to what companies are doing. Not that is always used for progressive ends. That can be quite a reactionary system in some ways. But as it relates to the energy transition, right? I think unions have to be sort of at the front of this conversation, and not just looking at unionized parts of the fossil fuel economy, but seeing a clean energy economy as organizing opportunities, right? Things like solar, which much of that work is ununionized, but looking for opportunities to organize workers in this new burgeoning sector of the economy. This is a little beyond sort of the scope of the paper, but if we're talking about something like electric vehicles, in this transition, you see companies trying to use electrification as an excuse to shed jobs, to not honor union contracts, which is the case with Stellantis right now, and generally to just do the sorts of things that they were planning to do anyway, right? Which is to pay less money to their workers. And so I think unions are really one of the only sort of backstops we have in that process, and having a government that supports that, it supports workers both to organize these industries, right? Having an NLRB that is as supportive as it has been over the last 4 years to new organizing, I think is one of the only ways to ensure that these jobs are good, right? Is to make organizing easier, ideally through something like the PRO Act, and to have the sort of way that incumbent industries are reimagined in the hands of workers, and not some from up on high in Washington or in state capitals.
Great. We have a question which I think is simple, but could have an interesting response from you, which is, do we need to accept bailouts insofar as they distort pricing? Like, is this something that's a part of the transition going forward?
Do we need to?
I would love Sarah to weigh in on this one too.
Yeah. Do you wanna take that one first?
I'll give it a start. I don't think we should. I think bailouts represent a failure, actually. And so I wouldn't necessarily start with the notion that we have to accept bailouts, but I do think we need to be clear-eyed about the fact that there could be requests for bailouts, and that I think will come through, and I'm guessing we'll see it come through kind of in terms implicitly, where it's not as blatant a cash infusion as you saw the banks get during the financial crisis. It might be essentially sort of backdoor preferences, putting your thumb on the scale in different ways in programs. Kate mentioned the Fed's, corporate bond buying program during COVID, or their Main Street lending program, where you kind of see the sort of fossil fuel companies getting particular preferences. Now, query as to whether they amount to, I'm not arguing that they amount to bailouts, but essentially, the notion that that we could come to a place where there will be requests, and they might not be requests, they might be like real demands, and particularly for people who think who think systemically, and think through systemic risk. You can also imagine the requests for bailout funds being cast in a frame of a systemic problem, so that if funds aren't given, there will be massive economic instability, downturns, recessions, massive unemployment. So I don't, that's that is my sense. I am, I've seen enough to observe that that there are that we've had bailouts, and that is unfortunate. I feel like if we had dealt with issues prior to some of these problems, we would we could avoid them. But when you see institutions like Silicon Valley Bank actually be designated a systemically significant institution, that is that which provided the ability for particular forms of of bailout to occur. So that's it's become part of the policy-making toolbox, for better or worse.
Yeah, and the ethic of the report is really that we should have plans in place when that happens. It has happened historically, whether right or wrong. It would be good to have some sort of climate conscious way to deal with them when and if that happens. And we started talking a little bit about the Fed a few minutes back, and I think just getting both to this question of sort of the mandate of federal agencies and things, and what it is that the government is supposed to do. If the Fed is meant to preserve full employment, is meant to maintain price stability, climate change should be a part of its mandate, right? And that is what folks in Sarah and other folks at Roosevelt and who have been working on climate-related financial regulation have made that case for a long time. That maintaining the stability of the economy means taking climate change really seriously. When you have tens of billions of dollars in one foul swoop in the course of 48 hours being wiped out, that is a problem for financial sustainability, right? And is only happening more and more. And so it is well within the mandate of the Federal Reserve to take that seriously. And I think there have been different voices who have had different views on that question. Jerome Powell's one view on that question, which we won't talk about here, but that I really think is going to be increasingly a strong pitch, particularly if you think about sectors like insurance, about fossil fuels, right? There is no part of the economy that climate change will not touch. And so for the Federal Reserve not to take that seriously is just negligence, I think. And, I'm not the first person to say that. I won't be the last. But I think, is well within the mandate. And so if, to get back to the bailouts question, that is the case, then having a plan in place for bailouts that does not just give money to companies which are driving the climate crisis would seem to fit pretty cleanly within what the Fed does.
I would agree. I think Roosevelt is building sort of a focus on the Fed and this macro interaction, and we are fighting that fight also, okay? I think we have time for maybe one last question, and I'll let this be a little bit broad, but what does the next piece of legislation need to include? Some people would call it an IRA 2.0, but if we're expanding the mandate from just building to winding down, what would that next landmark piece of legislation include, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, legislation is tough. And we won't talk too much about politics here, but passing a bill on the order of the Inflation Reduction Act on the scale, I think will be difficult. And so part of the report, looks at ways to manage the fossil fuel economy, which do not require legislation, which could fall, within the mandate of federal agencies in a self-evident way that, certainly could be challenged by the Supreme Court. I won't underestimate, or at the Supreme Court, I won't underestimate right-wing legal challenges, but I think there are real actions that agencies can take, some of which we talked about a few minutes ago. I would love to see federal legislation, and the proposal for a living will falls within the sort of Dodd-Frank for the fossil fuel industry, right? Ways to designate fossil fuel producers as systemically important, to create a sort of very specific means of regulating them that takes into account climate, that takes into account financial considerations as well, but is focused squarely on emissions and bring those down. But yes, passing legislation is hard. Sarah, I'm curious.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Passing legislation is hard, but I sort of on the silver lining side, I think there is a lot that agencies can do. Actually, even the things that Kate brought out, if in terms of this index, I would think that is squarely within statutory mandates for particular agencies that have been told to do certain things. So I think before we think we've got to kind of have a major piece of legislation, I think it's worth thinking through first whether there are existing mandates for agencies that are relevant that where they can be doing more. And then, of course, we do have to figure out how that would survive any kind of Chevron kind of deference test. But I would argue, just as Kate did actually so well on, talking about the sort of the Fed's mandate in particular areas, that, climate is, nobody's asking the Fed to fix climate change, but they are asking the Fed to take into account risks to financial stability. That's clearly within the mandate of the Fed as it exists today. And Chris also has been doing excellent work on the linkages really between climate and prices, food prices, and what this means for inflation. Hey, that's squarely within the Fed's mandate. So understanding the supply chain disruptions that are occurring and are going to continue to occur just from these weather events alone. I mean, I heard a report coming in just that, Asheville, North Carolina is not coming back anytime particularly soon. I mean, it is going to take quite a while to build it up again. And so this notion of sort of supply chain shocks coming in through climate events is a real one. And the effects of those shocks on price levels and on inflation levels, I think is like squarely within the Fed's mandate. So in other cases, you have to do kind of the analysis to, this Kate's idea, living wills. I'm not sure where that would live. I mean, we'd have to think that through. What existing agencies should be tasked with that, and does it exist in some statutory requirement already that Congress has directed the agency to look at? It could very well be the case that it does. We'd have to look at that quite carefully. And even Kate's idea about coordination, I think, is interesting. You had Dodd-Frank establish FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is the monitor really of sources of systemic risk, and this idea that you can designate institutions for enhanced supervision. Well, that model that obviously required legislation, but what is to keep agencies from talking to one another? What's to keep agencies from coordinating right now on some of these pressing issues and trying to figure out the risks that are bubbling up through the seams? So yes, I mean, legislation completely is going to be necessary in some areas, but there's also work I think that can be done right now with the appropriate analysis.
Great. Thank you so much. I think I'll give you both a couple minutes to say any sort of closing statements that you'd like to address the crowd here that we've had today. But thank you so much for your expertise and your great conversation. But I'll pass to you, Kate, if you'd like to have any last moments.
Yeah, thanks so much for everyone attending and for folks who helped organize this. You know, I am a journalist by trade, as I mentioned, so policy reports are not sort of my bread and butter. And you know, I really wrote this report to start a conversation about this stuff, right? I try to lay out everything I could, but there are very smart folks on this call, very smart folks who, you know, might listen later. And I think, you know, many different pieces of this could be fleshed out more, could be sort of put into model legislation, could be drafted into, you know, agency rulemaking in a more technical way. So you know, I'm excited to have those conversations with people and, you know, for folks with far more technical expertise than I have, to, you know, take this and see where it goes, right? I think that I've seen some folks writing already. There was a great piece in Heat Map on sort of powers the Loan Programs Office has to use its sort of ability to act as a private equity lender, basically, to realize some of these, you know, public ownership provisions in the report. So, you know, I'm mostly hoping folks take this and run with it. And yeah, would love to see some of these things realized at some point, which is, you know, a thrilling thing as somebody who writes on the internet for a living.
Well, I think people are going to take it and run, Kate, because I think what you've produced here is a very important springboard where you make the case, I think, so compellingly. I think there is no, you know, you've got very few analytical gaps here that I could identify as being particularly problematic. I found it quite compelling. We are living through, obviously, now an era where if it is not coming home to people that that we are living in a completely altered climate state, that the extreme weather events of the last week alone have will essentially have significant effects on our economy, on financial stability. I think your case for doing something in a coordinated, aggressive, proactive way is extraordinarily compelling. I think the proposals, I think we need to think about. Again, you've provided us a good springboard. I would ask people, particularly people who do policy, to be thinking through what some of these, how you would prioritize Kate's proposals, which you think could be done, should be done earlier than others, what can be done without legislation, what requires legislation. I think that's sort of the next step in this important set of tasks ahead. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to Kate and to all of you.
Thank you
Thank you
all
so
so much for joining us. And I will echo what Kate has said, that we are interested in opening a dialogue and getting creative and ambitious about what needs to happen. So we encourage you to write responses to Kate's work. We encourage you to reach out to carry this conversation forward, and hopefully we can have further conversations. So thank you, everyone. I will close us out. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.